Hello, my name is Glenn Kerr. I'm a Senior Translation Resource Consultant with Bibles International, and I'm here today to present to you my presentation concerning rhetorical structure theory, a new tool for Bible translation. So let me share my screen with you, and then we will go from there. Okay, rhetorical structure theory. As you can see, I have a question mark at the end of the subtitle because I'm not totally sure yet all of what might be useful for this for Bible translators, because this is a very new field and a new tool, and I'm still seeing how it's working for all of us. But it's good to begin with a little bit of a history of rhetorical structure theory. Rhetorical structure theory as a discourse theory for texts originated in the studies of computer methods for generation of texts in the early 1980s. So it was originally designed to teach a computer how to analyze natural texts and be able to structure them in some way. The theory focuses on the rhetorical relationships within the clauses of a text. And granted, it's a relative newcomer to the field of discourse structure and analysis, but it does seem to have some promise that might be worthwhile for us to consider. It is similar to, but not the same as, the traditional semantic structure analysis that has been around for a long time, that came from Beekman and Callow originally. And it focuses on a more simple and more basic level than semantic structure analysis, which also looks primarily at larger units of text, whereas rhetorical structure theory is focused more on smaller units. In order to begin the matter of rhetorical structure analysis, we need to understand the assumptions upon which it is based. It's basically based upon three assumptions which are linguistically sound. Number one, texts are not just strings of clauses. Instead, they consist of hierarchically organized clauses and groups of clauses that relate to one another in various ways. These relations, which can be described functionally in terms of the purposes of the writer and the writer's assumptions about the reader, reflect the writer's opinions for organizing and presenting the concepts. In other words, the relations are built into the rhetorical or the structure, the meaning structure that the writer is trying to get across in his rhetorical structure for why he says or she says or writes what they do when they do. Third, the most common type of text relationship is that which we would call a nucleus-satellite relationship, in which one part of the text is ancillary to the other. The concept of nucleus-satellite is probably one of the core elements of the rhetorical structure theory assumptions. If we go on, the first place to begin in making a rhetorical structure analysis is to separate the text or divide the text into elementary discourse units, EDUs. The EDU is the minimal textual unit of the RS tree, the rhetorical structure trees that we'll see constructed. The EDU acts as the leaf node of each RS tree, which means that it can't be split into smaller text units. So the smaller text unit, the smallest text unit, is this elementary discourse unit. The EDU acts as a syntactic constituent that has independent semantics. In this sense, an EDU corresponds to a clause or a simple sentence, but not a phrase. So phrases can make up clauses, EDUs, but the phrase itself is not an EDU. And then two, some EDUs may contain parenthetical units. In other words, some EDUs may have embedded textual units whose deletion does not affect their semantic meaning. So the elementary discourse units is the first starting point in rhetorical structure analysis. If we look at some of the classic lists of relations, in other words, we've got these nucleus satellites that we've discovered as we've done the EDU analysis, and then we discovered that they have relations to each other. And the classic list of relations is here. This is the very first list that you'll find in the writings. People have added to, taken away, modified these relations, but you see that you have a relation where a satellite indicates the circumstance of a nucleus, or it might indicate the solutionhood, the answer to what the problem in the nucleus, or elaboration or background on the issue of what the nucleus is saying. And then you can see also things like enablement, motivation, evidence, cause, result, justify, purpose, antithesis, concession, condition, otherwise, interpretation, evaluation, restatement, and summary. So these are relations between a nucleus and a satellite. Okay, also, the nuclei can have relations to each other. Multinuclear relations could be conjunction, where they're similar, where they're conjunction, neither one more important than the other. Disjunction, where they're actually sort of in opposition to each other. A sequence, where they actually represent sequences in a time situation, or a joint thing where you're more or less saying the same thing in different words. And then contrast, where the thing is being, what is being said in the nuclear statement is in contrast to the previous nucleus. Okay, so putting these together, here's a very simple diagram, remembering that this is a small part of a big text. We can see that you have EDUs, the 1, 2, 3 are the elementary discourse units, 1, 2, and 3. And then the EDU 1 bears a relationship to 2 and 3, which is concession. The central core of this particular structure is it was at least clear that something is at least clear. And within the context, we would find out what the it was at least, which is actually this guidance. This guidance was at least clear that investors could use it to price new portfolios. So we can read the text and then see that the text is trying to say there is something clear and that it could be attributed to this reason over here in number 3. So that's just a very simple, but somewhat complex in another way, diagram of just 3 EDUs. The EDUs could be things like circumstance, contrast, joint, motivation, enablement, where we have a satellite related to the nucleus. Again, satellite to nucleus. And nuclei related to each other. And here also as well. So these are kind of typical relationships, not the only possible relationships, but a few that we can illustrate. Now let's look at a little longer text. Not a terribly longer text, but a single text that is a single concept. And the title of this text is Lactose and Lactase, found in Scientific American, October 1972. The units are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the EDUs. The principal element here is lactose is a milk sugar. And elaboration on that, the enzyme lactase breaks it down. So lactose and lactase are related in this way. This nucleus is related to these 2 contrasting nuclei, which is that for want of lactase, most adults cannot digest milk. However, in contrast, in populations that drink milk, the adults have more lactase, perhaps through natural selection. So we can see these 5 simple EDUs related in this particular way. Now, a little bit more interesting one, I find this one a little bit more interesting. Overtitle is True Grit. So here's an article from Reader's Digest about true grit. Okay, so the first nucleus is a joint statement. My wife and I are both British and we enjoy visiting America. And elaboration on that nucleus is this satellite. We're particularly attracted to the landscape and architecture in Arizona. And now we're going to get over here to this main nucleus, which is the main point of the story. But while looking over a Scottsdale, Arizona model house, my wife was amused by the real estate agents, right? That's the nucleus. This is the circumstance satellite. And this nucleus has 3 other circumstance satellites related to it. My wife was amused by the real estate agent and elaborate because he thought kind of funny. And he said, we say tomato and Arizonans say tomato. We call a hood of a car boot and the trunk, hood of a car a bonnet and the trunk a boot. So now we move over to another circumstance. Then as my wife entered the dining room and 2 sequences, one agent pointed to a massive chandelier and asked, what would you call this in England? Solution hood is ostentatious, my wife replied. An ostentatious, I should reply. So here again, you can see this thing with 13 elementary disk units are all related to this primary statement of the text. Okay, now here's another example of the fact that sometimes these linear diagrams, as we've had previous in these others, normally laid out linearly, can get rather lengthy, especially if you have a very long text. And so it can be oriented vertically with the software available that has been used to make the diagrams for rhetorical structure theory. And so this is a story here. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of it because it simply is here to illustrate the fact that you can change the direction of the layout. And you can see the units, the EDUs are on the right side, the sequences and relations and spans are all on the left side, 1 through 8 and then 9 through 15. Okay, moving on, we have this particular layout. One of the experiments I did with handling rhetorical structure theory was do a complete analysis of the book of Ezra using rhetorical structure theory. And when I got done with it, the entire sweep of the book of Ezra done in the linear section, not the vertical, but the horizontal section, resulted in 40 changes of the computer screen to show the entire sequence. So that's rather massive. The practical way of using this was to break it down into smaller units and analyze each unit separately. And so here I have the very first opening section of the book of Ezra. And just to show one feature of the value of rhetorical structure theory is if we take simply the nuclei and string them together, we have basically a summary of the story. The Lord stirred up Persia's king Cyrus's spirit. He has commanded me, that is, Cyrus has been commanded, to build a house for him at Jerusalem, which is in Judah province. And then he should go up to Jerusalem in Judah, those who are interested in this. The people at his place should help the traveler with silver, gold, goods, and livestock, along with a freewill offering for God's house in Jerusalem. Then all the people around them help them with silver items, with gold, goods, livestock, and expensive gifts. King Cyrus also brought out the utensils for the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken for Jerusalem and put in his God's house. So by skipping from nucleus to nucleus and possibly paraphrasing a little bit, you can see that we can do a summary of the entire passage. And then also looking at this, we can see the basic structure. We have Cyrus's decree up here, and then we have what he's asking the people to do, and then we have the people doing what he asked, and then Cyrus actually acting upon his own decree. So it's kind of a balanced structure, an inverted structure of the entire thing, very evident in the rhetorical structure analysis. Now, another part in Ezra that I found particularly interesting is throughout the book of Ezra, there are many letters. And letters were sent back and forth by Persian officials to the royal king, whoever it might be, for his response and his decree. And two of them stand out to me. This first one is from Artaxerxes. It was written in response to a letter from Rehum, the commander, and others, trying to say that they shouldn't rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And so in this case, you can see that the first span is the greeting, the actual subject of the letter. And then Artaxerxes made a decree, they made a search, and they found, and this is the core of the thing, they found that this city has indeed made rebellion against kings from days of old. So he made a decree, they found evidence, and they found this. And then further, also powerful kings were over Jerusalem. And we might even say that these two are actually possibly nuclei related in a relationship of further information. But in any event, I didn't do that here. And then we have evidence he committed rebellion and they ruled, receiving tribute, all of this elaboration. So the king gathers this certain amount of evidence and then bang, he makes a decree to make these men cease, and this city not be rebuilt. And I warn you that you must not neglect this matter. So this is a very abrupt, simple, rather curt and unfeeling response to the Persian officials to stop the work on the walls. In contrast, in regard to the rebuilding of the temple, Tatnai, the governor, writes back to Darius, and Darius, first of all, makes a decree that they search through the records house in Babylon where important treasures were kept. So he first decides to research this further. They found a scroll, and they found in it that there's a decree. And the decree was to rebuild, and there was elaboration on how much was to be done, who was supposed to pay for it, and all of this. And so then his conclusion is these objects that were taken should be returned, and you should stay away from that place. In other words, allow them to continue rebuilding the temple and don't bother them, elaboration and other things here. And then going on further for the next span, because it is not enough I can put on one page, then he says, pay the cost for these men. In other words, not only allow them to continue, but actually pay for it. And then don't fail to give them things for sacrifice and food and other things. And do this so that they may offer satisfying sacrifices to the God of the heaven, and then further that they may pray for the life of the king and his sons. Anybody who resisted is to be impaled upright on a timber. And he asked that God, whose name dwells there, that he would overthrow every king or people that tries to stop this. So then Darius makes the decree. The interesting thing about this sequence is, in contrast to Artaxerxes, Darius is much more thorough and much more specific and much more aware of what needs to be done, especially once he finds the decree from the previous king. And so we can see that he has a much more thoughtful and evident approach toward the rebuilding in Jerusalem. And it's also evident because the structure is so much more complicated and has so many more facets to it. So if we've looked at these, just a few samples of things from the possibilities of rhetorical structure theory analysis. And I have worked on this quite a bit. I've selected just a few of those. I also have my paper on the website for the conference, and you can see that as well. What are the values of the rhetorical structure theory? Since I have a limited amount of time, I'm just going to be able to finish this up this way. First of all, it is semantically based rather than grammatically based, which means that it can be done even if a grammatical analysis is not practical or has not been done. Semantically based, and also because many times the relationships within a text are not grammatically indicated. There are not function words that indicate them. There are not structures that indicate them. So the semantic base will give a more clear overall picture of the relations within the text. And as far as diagrams go, they're a little unmanageable as far as size, but they're much less complicated. The diagrams are much simpler to do. And I think that's one of the beauties of rhetorical structure theory, is that the structure is more easily seen, it's less complicated, and therefore it can be demonstrated more easily. It is also a more universal approach. Since it doesn't require grammar analysis, it is something that could probably be done very easily by someone who is even where there wasn't an extensive analysis of a language, or a translator who would themselves be able to handle it. The nucleus satellite structure is a real seriously valuable thing to recognize. The system itself is flexible. It can be done in a lot of different ways. And it has a very, very simple software. The software is free. It works really well. And it actually, in my opinion, is kind of fun to use. So it is something that has appeal to it that could be used in a variety of situations to help analyze a text. And it also has built into it a practical way to summarize a text so that we know overall we can get the gist of a text and summarize it quickly. The weaknesses of RST, of course, is that it's a subjective analysis. It's not totally clear what is a rigid standard. So it's subjective. People are going to analyze differently. They're going to also have different opinions. There'll be different terms. So it's kind of flexible in that regard. And second, it's not good for long texts. We've already seen that it doesn't really work very well for long texts. The diagrams, though simple, are cumbersome as far as laying them out. That's the biggest disadvantage, is the diagrams, though simple, they have a long either linear or vertical length to them. And this is a new thing, so there's not a lot of data yet to compare, not a lot of examples of different types of analyses, so you can decide what might be the best way of analyzing something. So all of this is just somewhat of a drawback. But if this is, in fact, something that is of value and it can be used for the future, then it seems like we ought to be willing and able to consider it for future use. I personally have enjoyed playing with the thing in some ways and using it in other ways. It's been very practical in many ways. And I think that as people experiment with it and begin to use it, we will be able to find other uses. So I would recommend to translators and consultants and people in linguistics and literacy to simply start using this to see what we can come up with that might be long-term useful in Bible translation. Thank you very much.